and Patricia will now speak to us on school exclusion. So over to you, Patricia.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Kathy, and I am a bit nervous because I feel like you've really oversold a few things there. Like I don't think I've excelled at politics because I say politely, most commonly known for being the woman first elected in the history of Northern Ireland to represent North Antrim. But if we're being really honest, I'm more popularly known for being that first woman to resign as well. So let's be honest about a few things in that regard, which is good crack. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself because James, rather irresponsibly, I think, encouraged each speaker to say a little bit about themselves. You never do that with an academic, but I'll try to be short and sweet. I am from Larne. Don't judge me. Sorry, Angeline, I know you love it. Don't judge me, I'm from Larne. I went to a Catholic primary school called St Anthony's. I then made it into a Catholic grammar school. To this day, I still can't believe it, with a C1. Went on to Queen's University and did my undergraduate in law, master's criminology, PhD in education. For me, that's all an irrelevance when it comes to education. My parents were my primary educators. My dad was a hospital porter, my mum was a nurse, and they taught me everything I know from no age. My dad should have written the curriculum in Learning for Life and Work in the world around us. Everything I did from a toddler onwards was pointing things out around the town, historical artefacts, looking for shells and rocks and geology along the north coast down at Larne. And then my mum came in as the practical voice of reason and made sure I knew how to cook a cup of tea, she would say, and look after people and manoeuvre people as well. Now, how does this all relate to school exclusion? Well, I grew up as a Catholic in a loyalist town. I came from an interfaith family, not just Protestant Catholic, but also Indian, Norwegian, you name it, we had everything. And I was utterly confused because in Larne, I was nowhere near Protestant enough to be included, nor Unionist nor Loyalist. When I made it to Garntar, I was nowhere near Nationalist or Republican enough to be accepted. And in amongst all the chaos of my upbringing, I just felt a little bit lost. But, bring it forward into the modern day and it stood me in pretty good stead. I am what an academic has described as the most effective social chameleon they have ever met. Through survival, because you add the dimension of class, the dimension of female, and other dimensions that we don't have time to go into today, and it was just a recipe for change in action. So that's a little bit about me. When it comes to school exclusion, in my primary school experiences, my earliest memory was number one, having a looked after child in the classroom who on any given day would cut her own hair with our scissors during art and threaten to cut mine, would throw a chair across the classroom, would spit on other children and openly fight with the teacher, which was chaos back in those days. And we also had 5 children in the classroom, thankfully so who were quite heavily medicated and would have extreme additional needs. Whenever I began my career in 2013 in the adult world, I had a law degree and I couldn't understand why the day after graduation, none of those magic circle law firms had rang me to offer me a job. So my mum said, well, you better just start looking, and I found a job in a charity called Extern, where I started working with young people excluded from school. They were the second key educators in my life because they taught me the reality of life in Northern Ireland if you're dealt a different type of cards than I was. And while I was doing research to make the service better for young people in Northern Ireland, I found there had been no research done on school exclusion since the early 90s, and that they didn't start collecting statistics on school exclusion until the early 90s, which was crazy. And so my PhD was born. Now, before I go into the presentation, there's a couple of caveats. Number one, there will be swearing, but James assured me that as I'm not Presbyterian, I'll get away with it, and my partner at the back, who painstakingly comes to all my boring talks, reassured me there's confessions next Friday, so forgive me, God, for I'm about to sin. Some of the stuff can be a little bit hard-hitting, but also, as I've said, my parents were participatory educators, and the young people have taught me most of what I know that has enabled me to have a transatlantic career. So participation, fun, and cultural reality are at the heart of this presentation. Now, pre-warning, there will be swearing, but you will be asked to engage as well. So if anybody's nodding off or feeling asleep, I will target you and give you the microphone. Okay? And I'm delighted controversy was encouraged as well, because we're going to get started. So, Fair Isle fuckers, little shits, dangerous, deviant, disordered. This is some of the phraseology and imagery used by the mass media to depict some of our most vulnerable children and young people in society. Children who are 40 times more likely to be impoverished or free school meals. Children who are 8 times more likely to have a special educational need. And right across the UK, children who are non-Caucasian, Black, Caribbean boys predominantly. These are the 3 cohorts of young people who are most likely to be excluded from school, with higher morbidity rates as well. And to explain my interrelation again, I began my career as a staff member in school exclusion centres across Northern Ireland, became a school exclusion researcher, used all that information to get a PhD at Queen's. For some reasons surrounded or led by insanity, I then went into politics under the misgiving notion that I could change things. Came to my senses rather quickly after becoming an MLA and being a special advisor, and left and set up my own institute, the Institute for Disruption. When it comes to education in Northern Ireland, I advocate a different, enlightened approach about how we change things. Instead of starting with this dangerous phrase, inclusivity, whatever the hell that means, we start with exclusivity. Let's talk to the people that have been pushed out, that have walked out, that have left, that are on the margins, not just of our education system, but of society, and ask them what needs to change. What brought you back into education? What kept you within the realms of societal engagement? Now, I can't claim any sort of ownership for that idea because in true academic style, I stole it from another, much more learned academic called Roger Slee. And Roger argues that much of what is put forward in the name of inclusive education is having exclusionary effects. Think in terms of the 11 plus, to stratify young people of worthy and unworthy, deserving, undeserving. He says rather than focusing on inclusivity, which is just, what we call a policy concept, it's a concept that locks things together, the real challenge is to learn how to detect and understand exclusion as it presents itself in education. Once we do that, then we can start dismantling it. And more importantly, if we are serious about the business of planning for a future that is that's offering propositions for dismantle exclusion, then we have to begin with that exclusionary experience and try and take it apart, reverse engineer. And so with my PhD, that's what I decided to do. I did a qualitative study that prioritised only the voices of excluded youth in our school exclusion centres here across Northern Ireland. Did capacity building sessions with about 56 of those young people. I then did focus groups and individual interviews, and I set up what's called 2 peer advisory groups, made up only of young people who have been excluded from school. One that was about 18 to 24, predominantly young mums, and one that was slightly younger, and they told me how to go about engaging young people that were excluded from school. What I found in my research is that there's, by and large, about 3 core spaces that young people experience exclusion. From within and also outside of the mainstream system, and that's the experience we're going to look at today. On the way out of the mainstream system, which is the margins, on the other side of this diagram, this is where young people are thrust into the community without any sort of adult supervision. They're left without support, they don't have access to realise their educational entitlements, and the young people I spoke to were drug addicted, engaged in paramilitarism, committing crime. Some of them had also been incarcerated or through other forms of secure care. And then this space is in between, which is the really interesting space, because when I think about school exclusion, I think you're in or you're out, but that's not what happened. These young people, when they were excluded, the ones that were lucky made it into alternative education, which they call the spaces in between, where they kind of went through a form of educational recovery, almost like a 12 steps program for re-engaging in life. And the unlucky ones went into the margins. I'm sad to report some of them are no longer with us today. But because we don't have time today, we're just going to focus on the mainstream school experience. And before we get there, I just want to look really quickly at what is school exclusion. We have 2 dominant narratives here in Northern Ireland. The formal narrative is that, as Luke said, compared to the rest of the UK, our official exclusion statistics are dramatically lower than Scotland, England and Wales. So there's this misperception that we're a more inclusive jurisdiction. Now, a society that's been through 30 years of conflict with a religiously segregated education that's underfunded and at breaking point is the most inclusive in the UK. Doesn't really stand to reason, does it? But the next false discourse that stems from this narrative is that barely any of our young people are expelled, i.e. permanently removed, and that this punishment is only reserved for the most serious cases. That's not true, and we'll talk about that in a wee minute. But more importantly and interestingly, the Department of Education is proud of their exclusion statistics. For anybody that followed my assembly written questions when I was in office, there's some really interesting reading there, where the Education Minister at that time admitted that they don't have a mechanism for recognising, recording, or thereafter addressing multiple forms of informal exclusion that are happening whole scale. So what do we know? We know the data set about exclusion is patchy. We know that there is an overuse of informal mechanisms such as reduced timetables, being placed in isolation, encouraged absences, go home for the day, or go home and I'll tell you when to come back, or quite simply suspending a child or telling them not to come back to school and not officially recording it. So what do we know from that? Well, we know that there's an unquantifiable number of young people who have been informally excluded. So what can we deduct from that? The formal exclusion statistics are fake. They're not just wrong, they're not just faulty, they're fake. We're touting a false narrative about Northern Ireland. And then also, there's this really interesting thing that schools can do that I think is quite perverse, and it's called the Summary of Annual Examination Results or Statistics. This is a selfish plug for an article I've written, please check it out, I've written about this. But it's a criteria, a 10-point criteria, where a child who has experienced trauma, experiencing divorce at home, has been seriously unwell, whatever, isn't going to achieve the top grades, can actually be omitted from the official examination statistics wipe up at the end of the year. Their grades aren't counted in the school statistics. And again, this is a form of system blaming because we don't know how schools are performing. Now, in Northern Ireland, we're quite lucky because we don't have official league tables, but the Belfast Telegraph has taken it upon themselves to collate this data. So we're in the same high-stakes accountability environment as England, and teachers are being pressurised to behave in certain ways that are non-conducive to inclusivity. So a little gentle reminder, the exclusion agenda is alive, well and vicious. Our statistics are patchy. That matters because if we don't have accurate statistics about school exclusion, we cannot target need efficiently. What does that mean? We cannot get money into schools who most desperately need it. We cannot fund and create other services that will prevent exclusion. We are then promoting schools to engage in system gaming, and we're promoting society to engage in blaming. Okay. Very quickly, as it stands, Northern Ireland, broad scale, believes we only have one type of exclusion, formal, i.e. you're expelled or you're suspended. In my research, these are all the different types of exclusions young people identified. Informal exclusion, very briefly, can be class removal, being placed in an isolation unit, being put in a reduced timetable, anything from you're in school an hour a week to half a day a week to 3 days a week to 4 hours a day. But by and large, it's under half a day a week. Placed on rolling suspensions, you can't be suspended for more than 3 to 5 days in Northern Ireland. I've worked with children who have been out of school more than 56 days at one point in time. We talked about encouraged absences. Managed moves is another interesting one where basically head teachers horse trade young people among one another. You can take this young person and I'll take 2 of them, but it's not officially recorded. The young person gets to stay in the system, but none of this is followed by the statistics that the Department of Education requires are collated, and because there's no policy or procedure, managed moves tend to fail quite poorly, and that's what the research has shown us in England. The last 2 are quite controversial. Voluntary exclusion can be anything from elective home education, so that's where the parent chooses to remove their child and educates them at home. It's not state mandated. Early school leaving, where the young person leaves before 16, or truancy. Now, truancy is an interesting one for me because this is where the young person is framed to be voluntarily removing themselves. The research that I have read and engaged with, not just in the UK but across the globe, reveals that young people leave because they don't feel welcome, or they're frightened, or they're too anxious to attend because it's an unsafe environment. And the last one, benign exclusions, really relates to special educational needs. Now, before I say this, if anybody's going to start foaming at the mouth, because that has happened before, the creator of the Special Educational Needs Framework, Mary Warnock, has said herself she wishes she didn't create it. It no longer serves its purpose, and it's all about money. It's not about need and inclusivity, it's about money. Children who are diagnosed as having a special educational need arguably get more resource. There's more money given to the school, usually through a staff member. The literature, not me, the literature says that this tends to create segregation within the mainstream school environment, because we now have parents who are pushing for special educational needs diagnosis, schools who are pushing for the diagnosis as well. Also, they can get a label of forgiveness. Parents aren't responsible, the child's not responsible, they just have additional needs, and then finance so that the school can manage the needs. Okay, and it creates kind of like a marketplace of inclusion by label. That's as much as I probably can get to go into it today. But there are other forms of benign exclusion. When I say benign, it's done with good intent, but it has equally exclusionary effects. Okay. Even more briefly, the legislative framework in Northern Ireland is, like the rest of Northern Ireland, unnecessarily complex. We have 5 different school sectors here in Northern Ireland. The Education and Library Board Order 1993 doesn't stipulate what the legislative remit is for exclusion, it just stipulates that each school must have a scheme. The scheme is administered and governed by the governing authority, which is usually the Board of Governors, and then administered by the school. Now, you will see in the independent schools box, I have written Wild West in terms of governance, because I don't even know if they all are governed by Board of Governors. The independent school sector is literally a law unto itself. But anyway, enough of the boring stuff. Usually when I talk about school exclusion, people want to know why. Why are young people being excluded? And there are dominant discourses that I talked about at the start. Young people are mad, bad, sad, or persistently disruptive is the polite term used in academia. I just want to fracture that mindset for a bit, and before I go into what it says in the literature, share with you some excellent books that have fundamentally changed my mindset and that have mapped on to what the young people have told me about school exclusion. The first one is a book by Danny Dorling called Injustice, and he says, regardless of what anybody tells you, the causes of inequality can be linked back to 5 sins. They're beliefs that underpin injustice. Number 1, elitism is efficient. 2, exclusion is necessary. 3, prejudice is natural. 4, greed is good. And 5, despair is inevitable. Now, this morning I was thinking about this and going, how do we map this onto education? When we talk about elitism being efficient, think of the arguments that are put forward into academic selection at primary 7. In terms of exclusion being necessary, that's the narrative: our children are too damaged, disordered, disruptive, or expensive to care for in this school. They need specialist provision. When prejudice is natural, we're talking about things like ableism, class and sex. The statistics disproportionately show that children of colour, children who are poor, children with additional need are high candidates for exclusion. And in terms of greed being good, our education budget has always been in crisis, probably since I was born, and that taps into the educational needs, special educational needs stuff as well, about money being the answer. If money was the answer, schools in Africa would be having the same issues that we're having here, and they're not. And the last one, despair is inevitable. There's a mental health crisis in our schools, but also in our society, because this all relates back to capitalist notions of productivity, acceptability, and all the rest. So I recommend Danny Dorling's book. But if you want to go a wee bit deeper dive into the causes of school exclusion, Ashurst and Coos-Venn's work is probably the most efficient. They trace the causes of school exclusion back to early 19th century and kind of explore the intersections of social and educational policy and how it really is about targeting the poor. School exclusion is a complex relational dynamic that we're going to get into, but it centres around notions of deservingness and undeservingness that are heavily driven by whether or not you're wealthy or poor, and then how you choose to conduct yourself. I don't have time to go through that. Okay, so in terms of the literature, there's three levels of societal organisation. At the structural level, school exclusion is being driven by market models of education. It's about performativity. Schools are under pressure, they're under-resourced, teachers are under pressure, they need children who can get straight A's and perform. The policies that are in place don't create time, resource or energy for teachers to care for children to help them to exceed that aren't straight A students. At a cultural level, that creates a cultural setting of exclusivity, eliteness, coldness, disrespect and disregard. Throw into the mix individual issues at the child level of trauma, mental health, poverty, you name it, and it's just a recipe for disaster. But more importantly, Roger Slee says his main understanding as to why exclusion is not only happening but flourishing across the world is collective indifference. Collective indifference is best described by anybody walk down Castle Street Nobody here goes down Castle Street, okay. If you walk through the centre of town and there's a homeless person sitting there in dire straits, you kind of glance and you look away. That's collective indifference. It's the human inbuilt mechanism of looking away when you see something that's too difficult for you to cope with or believe you can change. In the field of education, collective indifference, looking away at all these issues we're about to explore, comes from bestowed knowledge, essentially the way we've always done things, okay? And the other one is experts. I've worked with children who have 26 support workers, have been through 13 services, where the whole statutory system is saying, well, there's nothing else we can do with this child, and nobody has stopped to think that maybe the way we're doing things is fundamentally wrong, and this pass the parcel mentality of framing children as too dangerous, disruptive or complex to work with is the issue, okay? So at this stage, if I'm doing my job right, you should be feeling uncomfortable, okay? But good, because discomfort equals growth. What you're going to hear is going to be even more discomforting. And let me say at this stage, before I rebut any arguments that people have screamed at me from audiences, that my job is not to state my perspective, it's to hold tension for the complexity of what we're about to go into, okay? So in terms of rebuttals, every time I go through this presentation, I get one of 5 arguments. What ifs? What if a young person stabs a teacher? Shouldn't they be removed? What if you abolish exclusion and all hell breaks loose? You know, common sense prevails here. I have worked with children who have stabbed people. I have worked with children who have been convicted of heinous crimes. Guess what? The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child says their right to education still stands. Okay? Rationalism, this is one teacher's too much to deal with all the complex behavioural issues in a classroom. Yes, it is. But I've seen things turned around in schools to the extent that they no longer use sanctions. And guess what? They still have one teacher in a classroom. So this is possible. Rights-based arguments, what about the other 29 children in a classroom? They deserve peacefulness, they don't want to be frightened. Yes, they do, but the theory underpinning human rights is your rights don't trump mine, and the rights of 29 children don't trump the rights of one individual child. It's about balance. Professional snobbery, my absolute favourite. The most common criticism levelled towards me is that I'm not a teacher. And I'm not, I'm a higher education teacher, like I lecture, that's not good enough. I'm not a secondary school teacher. Fair enough. But if you've ever had a child and you've been in labour, have you asked your midwife if she's given birth? Many of them haven't. So professional snobbery is a main barrier here to inclusive change. And last but not least, you cannot trust the voices of young people alone. Well, actually, you can. And if we're going to start talking about competence and adult competency, the events in Northern Ireland over the past 12 months are not a good benchmark to begin with. But legislatively, again, Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child says we are not only duty-bound, but legally required to seek the views of young people, number 1. But number 2, they have an extra provision. We are legally bound to give their views due weight. So they have additional protections than we do as adults. Okay, you're all looking suitably bored, so we're going to get stuck in. Before we do, each of my young people choose their own pseudonym, so they won't be identified. So you will see things like Dark Horse, Gypsy, Cadet, Bay. They chose those pseudonyms themselves. And what we're going to do now is try to understand what young people understand exclusion to be, what they think the causes of exclusion are, and thereafter how we can work to avoid exclusionary practice. And a gentle reminder, I'm only covering the first chapter, mainstream schools. The other 2 chapters you'll have to wait for a little while longer. But young people who I spoke to said that mainstream schools were a fundamentally damaging experience. They said exclusion began first and foremost when they felt they were being judged as damaged, disruptive or undeserving, and thereafter this laid the foundations for backwards teaching. This is where teachers demonstrated a lack of care, inaction in the face of bullying, untrustworthy behaviour, an oppressive teaching style, and also differential treatment. Once they were judged, they went through backwards teaching, then they experienced school as a prison. Controls get tighter. They said they were being watched, they were physically searched, they were being controlled, intimidated and punished. So what we're going to do is look at these individually. Okay, so we're going to start with theme 1, being judged as damaged, disruptive and undeserving. And this is where young people said they were framed to be damaged goods. This acted as a precursor to exclusionary treatment. It triggered the process of them being blamed and going through individualising discourses where they were labelled as bad, sad or mad. And it told them that they were unworthy. Essentially, this is where exclusion begins. You are unworthy to be in this classroom or in this school. And we're going to start off with Bay's story. Find my microphone. Everybody looks really awake now, but would you like to read Bay for me? Would you like to read Bay for me? I'll explain, just give me 2 seconds, let me go first. Bay, fantastic young girl, really bright, really switched on, really caring for everybody in the classroom, but tragically she had observed her mother being physically and sexually assaulted by a long-standing partner who had a psychotic break. Whenever she went into school, her mum thought she was being a responsible adult and told teachers about this experience just to keep an eye out if there was any behaviour that she needed to know about at home. And this is what Bay said. So take it away, Bay.
Because I don't want people coming up to me all the time and offering me counselling and all. It was always when I was on my own, but still, I just didn't want them to. They annoyed me, and I was always constantly being asked, and they wouldn't listen to me. So my mummy went up to the school and said, look, don't you be asking her, and knock it on the head.
Okay, brilliant, well done. That was great. So you can pass the microphone over because you see where we're going with this. So what happened with Bay, this framework or this approach of care, we've heard about counselling already and the need for CAMS or not the need for CAMS. Bay just wanted to be like every other young person. She had been through serious trauma, but she didn't want anybody to know about it. The teachers were constantly coming up to her, offering her counselling in front of her friends. So straight away the friends were like, what's going on? And she felt like she was just being disrespected and unworthy of being in the classroom. Things get a wee bit more interesting when we move on to Midget. Midget chose this pseudonym because he was exceptionally small for his age. I can't remember the name of the condition, but it plagued him his entire school life. Midget really struggled to get into school in the morning because he had caring responsibilities for other siblings. He lived in absolute poverty with one parent who also had addiction issues. So if you read Midget, and I'll read R, because I was the researcher, take it away.
The irony of asking the tallest guy in the room to read Midget's story. Midget, I was judged because I didn't come in every day.
Okay.
I would go into classes and they, the teachers, would be like, there's no point in you even being here. And then they would just give up. They would just give me work to do.
Was the work different to what the rest of the class was doing?
They didn't give me no work to do.
They gave you no work to do?
Yeah, I just had to sit there. They said things like, you've missed out on it too much.
Okay, so for Midget, it was a real achievement to make it into school on any given day. He was borderline illiterate and had slipped through the nets the whole way through primary school, now in secondary school, striving to get in, not only to see his friends, but to get 2 meals during the school day. He was told he wasn't good enough and there was no point. So now we'll move on to Cadet, and I'll not explain this story. First of all, if you want to read Cadet, and I'll read the responses. Yeah, go for it.
Here.
Yeah.
I was in a low class because of my behaviour and not because of my intelligence.
So it doesn't necessarily go by intelligence?
Nah, it don't go by how smart you are.
I'll do tomorrow. I've heard about that there as well. That can happen as well. Like,
it goes on how well behaved you are, to be fair.
And how they think of you. So you can see in this interaction, the young people in terms of worthiness are saying that you're going to be set it and streamed, you're going to be moved about classroom levels of ability if you can comply or if you don't comply. It's not about how intelligent you were. So you can see the extent to which they felt they were being judged. Okay, so it gives you a flavour of how the foundations for exclusion were laid. Moving on to backwards teaching. We're going to have a quick look at the different themes here. And just a gentle reminder, backwards teaching for the young people, it was their phrase, they came up with it, served the function of disrespecting young people who couldn't conform. It resulted in lessons being oppressive. What does that mean? There was a traditional pedagogical approach. Teacher talk, child listen. Teacher talk, child listen. For the children who couldn't conform, this created more foundations for conflict to occur, and it really just created an environment where things were not going to go well. If they acted out or didn't conform, they were then oppressed, uncared for, and further devalued. And the young people, again, their phrase says this amounted to relational exclusion. So next up, we have Mr. Devil. So if you want to pass the microphone back, yeah. Take it away, Mr. Devil. Mm-hmm.
They made me come back.
Who made you go back?
my year head.
Okay.
He said, you need to come back into school. You have more important things to do. And that was his exact same words, and that's why I fell out with him.
You have more important things to do?
That's why I fell out with him.
Why did you get to tell him that?
Yeah, I told him, I said, my granddad is only after dying. It's not my fault. And he goes, I'm sorry for all that there, but you have to do your schoolwork. And I was like, why are you being a dickhead for? And that's what I said. Why are you being a dickhead for? And he knew I was angry. So he just let me say it. And then after that, I just didn't really care.
Was that the time when things started to change?
Yeah, that's when it started going mad and stuff.
So you can see for Mr. Devil, a little bit of context here when it comes to Mr. Devil. He gave himself that name because he was called the devil in his Catholic school by a head teacher who said his behaviour was so bad it wouldn't even be tolerated by the devil. Now, I'm not defending this young person, but he's been through a lot. He lives in a peace mine, very high profile Republican family. The only person he really looked up to and was led by was his grandfather, so it was a major trauma whenever he passed away. His behaviour escalated to the point where he actually locked a child in a toilet cubicle and set the bathroom on fire. So I'm not defending these young people, their behaviour is unacceptable, but you can see how these obtuse sort of covert instances of backwards teaching can be the catalyst of things to start to go south. Okay, so we'll go on again with Teacher in Action, and now we're moving on to Gypsy. Again, she picked the pseudonym, so Gypsy, take it away.
They always said they would sort it out.
And then what would happen?
They didn't sort it out.
Would they speak to the young people involved?
They said they would, but they don't really. Teachers pick their favourites and all.
What do teachers do whenever they're doing that?
They said they would talk to them, and then they don't even.
Talk to who?
The bullies, the favourites.
Well done. So again, this is a story of exclusion hitting towards relational exclusion between young people, but it's actually a little bit more than that. Gypsy obviously came from a traveller family and had experienced chronic bullying. She decided to leave the school after she was thrown down a set of concrete stairs by a group of girls who had been harassing her for quite a long period of time. The school was made aware of it, the parents were continually in contact with the school, but it wasn't dealt with effectively to the point that she ended up physically assaulted and then decided to leave. So that's what she describes as teacher in action. Moving on to untrustworthy teacher behaviour, if you want to pass the microphone back to Sketchy.
Say you've done something on one teacher, right? They go to the staff room, right? And they fucking tell every teacher in the school. So then everyone in the school has it in for you. Because they are going to be fucking looking for you if anything happens in the classroom.
The first F-bomb, that deserves a round of applause, well done. So Sketchy picked this pseudonym because, in his own words, he was a wee bit sketchy. Great businessman, but an entrepreneur. It just happened that his entrepreneurial activities were illicit and illegal. And he was doing things at school that were quite naughty, but he had a point here in terms of untrustworthy teacher behaviour. The teacher had built a relationship of trust with them, got him to make disclosures, went and shared it with staff in the staff room, and then it came back to him through other staff throughout the school. Now, as an adult, if that happened to you in the workplace, you would have grounds for a grievance or bullying, maybe even a financial claim. Children don't actually have those rights of redress. And so for Sketchy, this is where untrustworthy teacher behaviour laid the foundations for exclusion to occur. Now, moving quickly on to an oppressive teaching style, this is going to be a bit difficult. So Midget, can you just shout out rather than moving the microphone about, and I'll do Tamara? Yeah, you get a loud voice, go for it.
They just stand up there at the front of the class preaching. It's like they talk, you listen. They talk, you listen, over and over again. What they say doesn't make sense and isn't even part of life. Puts my phone head away.
You're not on the same level as those ones, you're just a kid.
They think they are smarter than you as well.
So here, in terms of an oppressive teaching style, when the relationship is fractured, young people start honing in on the methods of instruction and saying, well, we've no relationship with the teacher, so the teaching style becomes oppressive. It's rote learning. Even where a relationship had been in place before, young people said that the teaching method of instruction was traditional and it was rote learning. It wasn't class or culturally appropriate, and therefore they start to switch off. So if you want to pass the microphone over, you're Millie.
Schools just set young people in straight lines. Tell them what to do, what to eat. Tell them to think. Tell them what to do about everything. And that is what my school did to me. So I'm like, listen here and listen there. Like, if they put us in a group that they would like us to be in, treat us like human beings, treat us like we are people and not dirt, then maybe they would get some respect.
Thank you. So in terms of Millie named herself Millbag, and we compromised on Millie for different reasons. But a child with about, I think, 10 or 13 siblings, a chaotic home life, a mother struggling with mental health issues, and Millie's coping mechanism was to become loud, boisterous and quite aggressive. Subsequently, she was diagnosed with ADHD, and she was in a zero-sum game with the school who said she couldn't come to school unless she took her ADHD medication. It just so happened that when she took that medication, she became sullen. She lost her appetite. She went from about a healthy size 10 to a 4 and completely started to disengage. Within 2 weeks of being with us in alternative education, she had come off the medication voluntarily. We couldn't tell her not to attend. It was about voluntary participation. She regained weight and she returned to her fully boisterous self, as you can imagine, was entertaining and challenging. But we'll hear, if we have time, a wee bit more about her as we go through. But this is her idea of an oppressive teaching style. And this then led to differential treatment, where young people felt like they were singled out for their other peers. So the next person line, if you want to do cadet, and I'll do...
So basically we were known as the group of bad children. That's what we were all called. We were all called the bad group by the teachers. We had our own table, our own friends and stuff. And I just didn't want to go back to that.
I think, do you want to shout, Bay? Are you okay, or do you want me to read it?
My sister used to say that they would make her put her skirt down to make sure she had a knee line. But they didn't do that to no one else. They always used to pick on me and my sister.
Like, I've had teachers just pick me out of the crowd and be like, you done it. Like I was the scapegoat. Do you know what I mean? So young people were well aware after they had been judged and experienced oppressive teaching styles and started to fight back, that they would then be singled out for differential treatment. And this is where things start to get really interesting. The next key theme we have about mainstream school is about school being a prison. That's not my language, that's theirs. They said they were watched, searched, controlled, intimidated and punished. And also in terms of school being like a prison, they said they were subject to unreasonable punishments that caused them to feel violated due to the level of control that was exerted over them. That their schools weren't places of safety and happiness, but of isolation, where they felt trapped and degraded. The schools thrived of a culture of mistrust and teacher suspicion, and ultimately this led to them feeling oppressed. So in terms of young people using the language of a prison, this is just 4 quotes out of, I'm not sure how many, where the word prison was used. So Boxer, it's like a fucking prison, my old school. Bay, it's a fucking prison, being held on your own. Millie, it felt like jail. Punk, it felt like being in Longish, hot hitch blocks, I swear to God. So you can see the level of passion that starts to come out here in the data. So if we go on back, would you fulfill the role of bronze for me?
When you're on the course, you are not technically controlled because everyone's watching what you're doing and you're being watched, and it's just creepy. Like, it's just to embarrass you to try and not make you do it again, and then I just do it anyway.
So for anybody that isn't familiar with the concept of being on report, it's when you misbehave, and usually a year head gives you a book that you have to take to every single teacher at every single class throughout the day, and they write a little review of you or note that you've checked in, and you get to see it before you go to your next class. But the young people hated this, usually because they could see negative remarks being made about them during the day, so consistent negative reinforcement. It also singled them out from their peers because they had to get to class earlier, they had to go to the front of the class and give over this mark of separation to people who are in a more powerful position. So we're going to move on to Dark Horse. Do we have a Dark Horse then? Yeah. Okay.
I just don't like it. See anything you do in that uniform, right? Say I was like walking to school from home, right? And say I'd done something, the teacher would be straight down to the principal. He's doing this, he's doing that. Well, he's wearing our uniform, so he's not setting a good example. And then they would have come up to you and would have started slattering to you, you know what I mean?
So for Dark Horse, the experience of being watched was a little bit more than just wearing the same school uniform. He was actually suspended from school because he was accused of dealing drugs. And the reasonable cause or the reasonable evidence that was found to substantiate the accusation that he was dealing drugs at school was that teachers had surveyed his social media pages where he was seen pictured with a bong, and another young person had made allegations in school, nowhere near the burden of proof that would be reached if it was handed over to the authorities, but for him, even wearing the uniform meant that he was being watched throughout the school day. Now, we're desperately out of time, but really quickly, I'll not read the quotes, but in terms of Lisa, she talked about being searched, where in school she was taken to the head teacher's office and patted down by a male member of staff. They did the traditional pat down to make sure she had no contraband on her, but they also made her pull her bra out and shake it to make sure that nothing fell out of her bra. For her, that was a major form of degradation, and it's here that people begin to challenge the truthfulness of the quotes that the young people have supplied, and it's here that I say I didn't triangulate this data by speaking to other school teachers or their parents. I focused only on the young people, but I did have access to their school records, and I did have access to their current staff members who in many ways were able to substantiate the claims the young people were making. But more importantly, regardless of this issue of truth, because we now live in a post-truth world, this is how a young person felt. They felt violated and degraded, and that's what matters here. In terms of school rules, there's nothing new. Young people being suspended for showing up in black trainers instead of black shoes, being put in the isolation room for having their skirts too short or refusing to take out their piercings, and ultimately feeling like they were being controlled and intimidated. I've already told you about Millie, but really quickly, let me tell you about isolation. Isolation is one of those informal mechanisms of exclusion that the Department of Education refuses to even acknowledge, let alone write a policy or a procedure around. There's no mechanism for collecting data about when isolation is used, and there's no guidance about how it should be used. There's one piece of legislation that says if you isolate a child, you should not lock the room that they're in. My young people were put in isolation units, sometimes for a day. Bay was in there for 6 weeks before she made it into alternative education. And I've also worked with young people who were locked in store cupboards, placed under desks, sat in the corridor, not allowed to go to the toilet for the duration of the school day, not allowed out for lunch. So while these activities go unrecognised, unregulated and unquantified, we really are into a dark situation when it comes to behaviour management at schools. The other part of isolation that I thought was quite interesting was one school had a specific isolation table where the young people that were allowed out for lunch could go to the lunch hall, but they had to sit at a table called the isolation table. And it also developed a sense of camaraderie, not just amongst them that were isolated, but other students walking past who said, as comedian says at the bottom here, they would just say, fair play to you or keep it up, because they were resisting. So I don't really have time to go through this, just to say there's another 2 chapters of data that hopefully I'll get a chance to present on when the research is no longer embargoed. And just to wrap up and say, what were the key findings? Well, young people said exclusion is not a binary concept. It's not just about being in or out. It's an oppressive relational dynamic that stems from 4 things: the causes of bad behaviour and unhappy teachers or schools being individualised to young people who were viewed through a deficit approach. There was something wrong with them rather than the teachers or the system. Another driver of exclusion was the extent to which they were criminalised by being in a mainstream environment that was more prison-like in nature than safety and educational welfare, and then the pathologisation that came with their needs. The way I've been trained is that all behaviour is a form of communication. When you're taking that approach, no matter what a young person's doing, it's pretty hard to pathologise them. Your task is to decode why they're behaving the way they're behaving, to keep themselves safe and to work with them to thrive. So young people told me in my research, exclusion is a relational issue. It's driven by negative relational dynamics, but with the right supports, efforts and resourcing, it's avoidable and young people can recover. And that's what happened to the young people I worked with in alternative education. If we have more time, I'd tell you about some solutions and how to fight back against the exclusion agenda, but suffice to say, more funding does matter. Regulation of the different types of informal exclusion matters, but so does a pedagogy of relationships, realising that we no longer stand up and talk the way I'm doing right now, but it's a process of co-production. Children teach me as much as I teach them, and also that we need to create more opportunities to democratise education. The last panel participants talked about this in great detail, and it's fantastic. Northern Ireland now has a secondary school students' union. There's not a single young person in it that's been formally excluded or that's attending an alternative education centre in Northern Ireland. So we need another union for these excluded youth as well. And then last but not least, there's a body of work to be done in terms of fracturing this discourse and getting teachers to engage in some critical reflection. Not teacher blaming or shaming, but critical reflection to create inclusive opportunities for change. And I swear I'm finishing. This is my last slide. As you can imagine, after studying this for 4 years and working in the sector for 10, I was pretty depressed. Our education system is fundamentally broken. My supervisor doesn't let me say that. She says cracked. It's fundamentally cracked. So in those times of despair, I turn to the legendary songwriter that is Leonard Cohen and repeat this to myself over and over again. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. I'm eternally grateful to the young people who slipped through the cracks of our education system and for those cracks that still continue to widen and exist, because without them, I wouldn't be brought to this work. And I believe that young people are going to light the way for inclusive change to happen in Northern Ireland. And on that note, I will end and say my contribution today is dedicated to every excluded youth that is going through the process in Northern Ireland. So thank you.
Right, Patricia, thank you so much. I think you have totally managed to disrupt all of our thinking. And,
Good.
I'm not going to hog the questions here. So anybody got any questions for Patricia?
Can I just say, I taught for 4 years in an old boys secondary school. It wasn't a big school. And I was fortunate that I was privileged to be there. That's the first thing. I wanted to be there. And you have to want to be there. And you have to want to be there for the children. Your heart has to be in it. I never taught any bad children, ever. I taught children that had problems. But I got to know my children, and I got to know what I did. I knew other people in the community anyway, and that was a huge, big asset for me to know the parents and the grandparents and the children, and it made a huge, big difference. But what I see, part of what I see happening, I see because of our 11 plus, we get back to 11 plus again, our transfer system, I see when we move more and more towards concentrations of poverty in too many of our secondary schools now. And I look at it, I think it was last year, I looked at the top 10, the Sunday Times best list for the top 10 schools in Northern Ireland according to their academic results. And they have an average, they're all grammar schools by the way, and that won't surprise anybody. But they have an average free school meals intake of 7.2%. The average secondary school takes over 37% free school meals, and there are about a quarter of the secondary schools in Northern Ireland that have over 50%. And high concentrations of poverty cause all sorts of problems. The Coleman report, which was published, Equality of Educational Opportunity, James Coleman's report, 1966, he's an American sociologist. It's a very, very important report. And what he simply said was this: being poor will always be a disadvantage wherever you are. But being poor and being in a school full of other poor children will double your disadvantage. Children always do better when they're in with other children that are better children, whatever way you define better. But I was telling a story to Frank during the interval. I taught a year 11 group, and they were very challenging. And they were in the bottom stream, and they felt bad about everything, and they felt bad about school, and they felt bad about where they were in school. And they've been failures probably from the day and hour that almost set foot into school. And we used to do and stuff about November. There'd just be a lot of messing about and horsing about. But anyway, one year the vice principal decided to have all the examinations, all the term examinations in the big hall. So we had 100 kids in the big hall, year 11s, in the big hall to do their Christmas exams. And there were 18 boys in this particular group, the C11 group. And I was in the hall for 2.5 days when they were doing their exams. And their behaviour was almost as perfect as you could get for those 2.5 days. Not because they were worried about the teachers who were in the place, but they felt bad enough and they didn't want, it was the peer group pressure and the way their peers felt about them. They didn't want to be stupid. They felt stupid enough, but they didn't want to be stupid and they didn't want to be told off in front of their peers in the class who were probably doing a bit better at school, a bit more engaged with schoolwork and exams and whatever. And so for those 2.5 days, they were really, I was so proud of them.
I think it's culture. I think what you're describing is culture. Like, you know, in this work I see a lot of people that try to pinpoint a singular cause, like it's the teacher, it's the young people, it's the system, it's the fun, it's all of it. It's all comes together and it creates culture, and culture comes from the top, not just in terms of Northern Ireland but Westminster, and a fish rots from the head down. So the culture that we're setting through our policies, legislation, behaviour and resourcing as adults has an impact on the school. And then you have blockers, protectors, you know, things that can make young people thrive and succeed, such as peer support or, you know, peer observance. But then that can go horribly wrong as well. The challenge is there's no set ingredient. You're not cooking a meal, I think, whenever it comes to reversing what's happening here. But we know things that might work. Does that make sense? You know, so, and you're describing a lot of them. Yeah.
I think it's much more complex.
Yeah.
And there isn't any one single solution. But the big part of the problem with our education system here is that it is a system based on elitism.
Yeah.
And it's a system that's run by a very powerful group. It's a system that has benefited that group. It's benefited them and their children and will continue to benefit them. And I was talking to...
I'm going to step in because we're over time already. There's another couple of questions, but we really don't have time. Can we stop now? We have 10 minutes until the next. We're back in for 4:05. And can I suggest those other questions if I'm sure Patricia will be happy to...
I'll stay here. And this is... The craziness you see around the room is some of the stuff the young people actually produce. So I'll be hanging out here if anybody wants to come up and have a look and ask any questions. And I have the 3 book recommendations here as well, which I'm not getting commission on, but have a look. And if you have questions.
Brilliant. Just thanks, Patricia, again.
No, thank you. Thank you.